Good afternoon. Thank you for asking me to come in and talk today about the implementation framework for the Kansas Water Plan. I'm Julie Lorenz. Previously, I was the Secretary of the Kansas DOT, and I think you'll start to see as I talk through this presentation, there are some similarities between transportation and water. They're not exactly the same at all, but there are some lessons we can learn from 40 years of successful transportation programs that we can apply to water. And to my friends from the Senate Ag and Natural Resources Committee, I'll point out I do have a little bit of new information for you, so it's not exactly the same thing, so you don't have to, so I'll wake you up when we get to those parts, so to speak. All right. In terms of the presentation as it comes up, if you want to, for those of you who have a hard copy, we'll just go on to slide 2 so we're not wasting any of your time. Water has a huge impact on our state's economy. Our two biggest drivers of our economy, ag and manufacturing, both rely heavily on water, as well as when we think about trying to recruit or retain businesses, understanding that oftentimes before a business will decide to make an investment in a state, they want to know that there's a water supply, and typically they're looking for something like about 40 years worth of water supply, and there are places in our state that do not currently have that much water available. Okay, we'll go back a couple of slides, please. Yeah. If we can't, I will, whoops, wrong. Let's see. Or we can just go all the way to the end and come back around and start again. Because sometimes there's that, like, if any of you have ever been on a roundabout before, you know how that works. Okay. All right, thanks. We're going to get our act together here. All right. Also, I would point out that the state's approach to water in terms of how we use our water is the best idea is to withdraw water and then have it returned in the same condition back to the groundwater or to the stream. A good approach would be where it is withdrawn and then it has to be treated, but it's returned. And then a conditional use is when you pull water out and then it either evaporates or it is lost from that system. So we're always trying to get to the best and then the good approach. Okay, next slide, please. All right, and so in terms of like how water works in the state of Kansas, and some of you already know this, but on the west, we rely on groundwater, the aquifers. And then as you go toward the east, that's where we start to rely on surface water, and we collect those in reservoirs, both for drinking water, but also as a way to manage floods. So I would just tell you this, every part of Kansas has a water problem. It just depends on where you live, and how you solve that problem varies depending on where you live, and the price point therefore varies. I would point out on the far west, for example, the counties that sit on top of all those aquifers, if you add up their GDP, it amounts to $57 billion per year. So water is really important to the state, and on the east side, really important for economic development and growth. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so for example, if we look to the far west, and you look at those, and they rely on irrigation to grow crops, right, for the most part. There is dry land farming as well, but what we're focused on right here, those gray areas, you can no longer irrigate from those areas that are shaded in gray. So that means either you go to dry land farming or you are going to really have a hard time getting much farming done. Next slide. And let's focus in for a minute here on Wichita County, which is in GMD1, Groundwater Management District number 1. And I think if you go on to the next slide, this is really an interesting point here. So on the left side, what you see is that as water has been pumped, those water levels have declined. Okay, and if you kind of look up there from 2000, you can see, there was a dip, it started to rise, and then you notice an appreciable decline in the water availability. If you look to the right, these are corn yields, and you see at that same time frame kind of peak there in the year 2000, and now you can start to see corn yields are declining. So we've got less water and we're able to grow less corn out there. And there's a quote there that I think is important for us to bear in mind as we look to the future of water in our state. And it's from Mr. Watt, who's been farming for 23 years. And he says, we overpumped. We didn't know that it was going to run out. And so we've got problems, and Water is a two-way street here. On one hand, you can influence water amounts by how much you use water, but also it's a Mother Nature thing. Some years we have more water, more rain, some years not. The aquifer in some places doesn't recharge, in other places it does, but at different levels. So this is a complicated issue because both humans have an impact and Mother Nature has an impact. And so it's more complicated than transportation. Okay. I would also want to point out GMD1 has now implemented measures so that they can get to a stabilized aquifer. So I also want to point out, in places where people are taking action, they ought to be applauded for the action that they are taking now, that they understand the data and the implications of the actions. Okay, next slide. And so there's this ripple effect. So, okay, maybe we can't grow as much corn because we don't have as much water. Well, that's one impact. But you have to think about the whole life cycle then. When you know that 24%, okay, so you might as well say a quarter of all of the U.S.'s cattle are fed here in Kansas feed yards. And then you take that a next step. And our feed yards supply meat for production. Our beef industry employs about 19,000, you might as well call it 20,000 Kansans, with a direct economic output of over $12 billion. And then on top of that, we produce 11% of the nation's red meat. So there's this ripple effect, and if you trace it back, it all goes back to water. So protecting our water is super important, and having a plan for that water is every bit as important. Next slide. Okay, so that's the west story. Now we go over to the central and the east side of the state. So 2/3 of Kansans rely on reservoirs for their drinking water and for storage for floods and for protection from drought. So again, I go back to that, every Kansan has a water issue. And when you look here at Tuttle Creek, which is responsible for over 1 million Kansans for water supply, you can see right now we're at about 50-50 in terms of our sediment and our storage remaining. When you look out to 2070, we lose 90% of our storage. So you always know that you're gonna, when you build a reservoir, you know there's gonna be some silting in. But it's happening faster. We haven't provided enough maintenance to some of these reservoirs. So the problem's growing faster, and as you have increasing population growth, you need more storage just at the time that we're losing storage. You look over at Elk City, for example, the problem isn't as dire, but you can see you still only have 40% of storage by 2070. These projects are similar to like large-scale transportation projects because you have to do the planning and the feasibility, and you have to figure out how you're going to fund these projects. So there's a similarity there. Okay, next slide. When we look at, in addition to the water supply, we also have to think about wastewater treatment. So when you look to the west, like at Hilmer, we knew that we were going to need to offer an opportunity for that wastewater to be treated and potentially reused. And on the east side, when you get like to a Panasonic opportunity, what you want to look at is being able to expedite your ability to permit their actions and be able to move forward quickly. So there's this ecosystem of economic development as well as people relying on water. Okay, next slide. So, the Water Authority, going back at the beginning of 2024, said, we've got this great 2020 water plan. And in fact, if you look back under Governor Brownback, a lot of the good ideas kind of started with that task force. And then they've evolved until 2022. There's this water plan, but a plan doesn't do you any good if you don't put it into action, right? If you don't operationalize it. And so this idea of like, let's have forever water sounds good, but I don't know how to provide forever water. I just don't know how to do that. What you can do is start to say, all right, what if we looked at a 50-year time frame? What could we do in 50 years? What would that look like? And even that is too long to plan entirely for, so you start to look at a 10-year time frame. And so we have put together an implementation plan for the water, for the overall water plan, and we have been able to identify investments and outcomes and what a rolling program would look like. And so I'm going to talk you through the top three, which are the most related to economic impact. And I'd be happy at any time to come back and talk about all of them, but we're just going to stick with the top three right now. The first is this multi-generational promise, which is to say every Kansan should have access to 50 years worth of water or have a plan of how they could get 50 years worth of water. So that's the first one. And so from now until so this is 2025, 50 years from now, by 2075, we'd have a plan to get to 2075. In 2035, after 10 years, we'd take a look and we'd say, all right, how do we get to 2085? So there's this rolling plan, and every generation makes sure that like your kids and your grandkids would have a water supply or a plan for how to get to that water supply. The next has to do with regional planning and project development. So as you start to think about, a good example would be Caney and Coffeyville. So Coffeyville is going to sell Caney, who's about to run out of water. They're going to sell 250,000 gallons per day. You have to be able to move that water. You got to think about the leaky pipes and how you're going to fix the leaky pipes so you're not losing so much water. But you want to do this. We'll stay on that slide for a minute. We want to be able to think regionally about where can we have connections between communities so they can share water if needed. Where can that work and where doesn't it work? I thought it was a really, and that also relates then to number 3 recommendation, which is this regional idea of how are we going to have good investments that we can track the return. How can we make sure Kansans have access for economic development or for ag? And one of the quotes, we did this local consult process like we do in transportation, and one of the comments that has really stuck with me is someone said, you know what, a community without a plan is a bad investment. So understanding the conditions of every community and how they're going to be able to get water, and there's also a real good nexus there to local control, because in Kansas, water has traditionally been provided at the local level, so we've got to figure out how all to work together. And that's what these top 3 recommendations really drive toward. I would point out that next level, streamlining the water programs and creating a dashboard and emphasizing problem solving and outcomes. This is a stronger way of looking at water investment in our state, and I'm going to walk you through some examples of that. But I can appreciate, as legislators, you need to be able to go back to your voters and taxpayers and say, we're investing this much money. These are the outcomes you should expect in the next 2 years and at the end of 10 years. And so that is the way we do it in transportation. If we get a good bid price, for example, we may say, all right, we'll build 2 more miles of highway, or we may say we've got projects over here that need more attention, we'll move those dollars over there. That's why we need a pipeline of projects, so that as conditions change, we can advance projects when we have the opportunity. All right, next slide. Texas, I would just want to point out, does a really good job of doing long-term planning, and there's some lessons that we could learn from there. We're not there yet. This is still a work in progress. If we could go on to the next slide. But this is fantastic work that they do. They look at each of their industries and they forecast how much water they're going to need over the next X number of years. We need to start doing that in our state. We're not there yet, but we need to anticipate how much is ag going to need, how much is advanced manufacturing going to need, and then back into, so what does that mean each region needs to have available? We're not there yet, but that's a good example of future kinds of planning. Next slide. And then they take that, okay, that gap, right, from here's what we have to here's what we need, and they assign a dollar amount. Now, I would be quick to say, yeah, Texas is just a different size, a different scale. But the concepts are really good of projecting in the long term what we're going to need to spend. So I just wanted to point that out as something that in the long term we need to be moving toward that direction of better forecasting and planning. Okay, next slide. In terms of, people have asked this question, and it's a good one, which is, what's the value of water? This is the work that Texas has done, and so I want to share it with you and their methodology. So they say, okay, 100,000 acre feet of additional water supply would underwrite more than $30 billion of economic activity. Translated into a way that, like, I can think of it a little bit better, each gallon of local water supply in a major Texas city produces about $1 of economic activity. So you apply that to Wichita, for example, if you use that same formula, and we would say that about $55 million of economic activity per day is based on average local water usage. So it's really valuable. Are our numbers exactly the same? I can't say for that, but the idea is certainly relevant in terms of how valuable water is, because you just can't make more of it. Mother Nature's not always our best partner there. So when you think about a water plan, we need to think about water to grow our economy, retain our businesses. We need to help our communities be able to do better planning, and we need to manage our resources and also be thinking about innovative solutions from technology. Next slide. So with all of that as background, we developed this framework, this implementation framework. 2-year ramp up, that leads to 10-year outcomes, and we have 8 specific recommendations that I just covered with you. We could have had 100 recommendations. We focused on what we thought were the most important, 8. Okay, next slide. So we didn't do this in a vacuum at all. Kind of using the local consult approach that KDOT uses, we went around the state twice. We heard from more than 1,500 Kansans. We had stakeholder meetings, more than 50 stakeholder meetings with like the RACs and the Water Authority and the Groundwater Management Districts and KLA and the Farm Bureau and conservation districts to get their input. We have 43 clearly defined outcomes. Here's what investments will bring, and we have 8 specific recommendations. All right, next slide. From all that input, I could sum it up in 3 pieces as to what people had to say. Urgency. There are problems that need to be addressed right away. Kansans are supportive of a 10-year program that is similar to transportation, where they can understand the criteria that's used for selection. They can understand the funding sources. They said $140 million per year. They would be supportive of that, and I'll talk about how we came to that number in just a minute. They also said, so that's bold, right, to say we're going to have a 50-year water supply for Kansans, but they were also very practical to say, not quite yet. They want to see a 2-year ramp-up period for the agencies to do some more planning, to get more organized, to be able to report transparently on the outcomes. I feel really good about this overall approach. Next slide, please. So the value, like why again are we looking at this 10-year program? We have more than 100 communities that are at risk of running out of clean water supply in less than 25 years. That will limit our ability to, for economic growth, and in some places, even economic vitality for communities. There is this connection between producers and communities. If you don't have producers, you're not going to have communities. And if you don't have communities, do producers want to live in that area? It's an important question to work toward. And communities need help, we heard over and over again, technical assistance so they can come up with grant ideas and they can use funds to solve their water problems. This 10-year program addresses some of the biggest challenges by developing big projects and having pipelines of projects that communities can draw upon. Establishing these regional understandings of what the criteria looks like so that, much like KDOT, people can understand how project decisions get made. Next slide. So this is a quick example of how we've got the 2-year ramp up, local consult, assuming that dollars are made available to do these consults, with refining going on. So we test a program and we're like, oh, it's doing really well. Maybe we should invest more money. Or we test a program and it's like, it doesn't work as well as we think. Maybe we take money away from that program and apply it in a different way or get rid of the program. But every stakeholder has some interest in one of these programs. So we're not just going to take programs away without having conversations with stakeholders. And I've talked a bit about this 50-year water review. Okay, next slide. All right, this slide is probably the most important in terms of understanding how it all sort of fits together. And you'll see 3 colors. Green relates to legislature. Blue are agency activities, and yellow are stakeholders. And so when you see how this rolls out, agencies can begin right now thinking about how they're going to measure programs. They can start thinking about how they're going to evaluate the impacts of their investments. Legislature can take a look at if they want to fund more activities for that ramp-up period. We need to launch some of those recommendations where not additional funds are needed. We can look at local consult meetings every 2 years to hear from stakeholders. This green bar where it says legislature establishes long-term dedicated revenue source, that's the one that speaks to the legislature. So when we went around and talked to communities and people about this 10-year program, we asked what they thought in terms of revenue sources, but it wouldn't be our place to make those recommendations. So in the back of the report, there's lots of information for you all to look at. No surprise, people said, we'd sure like to see the money that we are paying at taxes come back to our area. No surprise there. I would just pause for a moment and point out the legislative task force that was pulled together in 2018 for the transportation program, went all around the state. Representative Prail, Senator McGinn co-chaired that. That was sitting on top of 30 years of transportation experience. This is like, get in the go back in time machine with me on water, because we don't have that kind of 10-year program, but you all have the opportunity to start putting that program together. That kind of data, that kind of process that will serve the state well in the long run. So you're kind of at that sweet spot, and you don't get the chance to build a 10-year program very often, particularly the kind that served our state so well. So as you think about a task force, that's part of what they would do, so that in 2 years from now, you would have a sense of the kinds of dedicated revenue source you'd want to put together, and you'd have a sense of what level you want to fund a program, and you'd have 2 years of evaluation data to say, where do you want to see those investments made? Okay. Oh, so that little green box there under 2027, you could pass a program like in 2020 when Ike passed with 94% support at 2 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon right before everybody had to go home for COVID. It's possible. And water is an infrastructure thing like transportation. Everybody needs it, and it can be a really good bipartisan thing. Okay, next slide. So this is this idea around being a scalable program where you can start to see what outcomes could be achieved in 2 years. If there were ramp-up funds, more funds made available, what could be accomplished there? And then what can you expect over 10 years worth of investment? Next slide. This is great thinking, more like we do in transportation. When we went around the state, we asked folks, we shared with them the outcomes that would be available at 60, 120, and 360 million per year. And we listened to hear what they thought was most important. And then when we came around in the second round, we said, okay, 140, using the outcomes that you said were most important. We took that back out to Kansans, and they said, yeah, those are the outcomes that we'd like to see. We might even be willing to see a higher investment level, but again, we think that you've captured the most important outcomes. Next slide. Okay, in transportation, we look at things like preservation, modernization, and expansion, and then we have line items under that. That's an approach that's been, that's moving. I think it takes some time to get comfortable with that. But instead of 50 line items and 14 agencies that touch water, thinking about water in a more systematic way and in a problem-solving way will serve the state well in the long run, and it might take us a while to transition to that. But this shouldn't be about how I'm going to fund 50 individual programs. It should be how am I going to solve my 3 biggest problems and how much do I want to invest in those. Okay, next slide. So in terms of outcomes on the water quality side, and I didn't even mention the 3 biggest problems, aquifers, water quality, and reservoirs. So this is an example on the quality side of things. On the base budget at $60 million, you could get to private well testing and repairs and replacements for septics at 10 counties. If you went to 90 million, 25 counties. Over a 10-year period, you could get to 50 plus counties with multiple locations. Next slide. On the reservoirs, so this is an example of like a dredging pilot project in 2027 for Tuttle Creek that impacts more than 1 million Kansans. By 2027, with additional funds, you could get the hydrosuction pilot at John Redmond. At the end of 10 years, these are the kinds of reservoirs you would get to with 100% in reservoir sediment management, affecting more than 1.7 million Kansans. And so I would suggest it's the legislature's role every couple of years to say, what progress are you making toward those big outcomes? And this is a way for you all to measure and hold everyone accountable for the investments that are being made in these programs. Okay, next slide. And then resiliency, and to be clear, resiliency, as Kansans defined resiliency across the state, is to say, to have better protection against droughts and floods. And in this case, it's improving infrastructure and these tech assistance grants, and that's, our communities need help in figuring out how to do the engineering and how to do the water analysis kinds of things. And that's where you see the biggest increase in terms of the ramp up dollars. There's a $10 million proposed increase there. Next slide, please. This one is an independent evaluation. You'll notice I said independent, so this would be put out for an independent evaluation of the various programs to see how effective they are and what recommendations to make improvements. Next slide. Okay, this is the proposed budget across the various problems areas, you might say quality, quantity, reservoirs, the resiliency, research, and education. Next slide, please. All right, this one is how you tie the framework to the outcomes. We know we have a declining water supply. The recommendation is to move to a 50-year rolling supply through a 10-year program. We know communities need more support. We have increased funding for infrastructure grants, more technical support, and encouraging this regional collaboration. And again, going back to if a community wants to apply for a grant, they have to have at least considered if they could be part of a region. Water quality investments to get 150 rivers and streams back to clean for all use. And then this, your constituents might have a hard time navigating all the various water programs and agencies, the effort to start to streamline and increase transparency across the programs. Next slide. I think we're getting close. Maintaining momentum. Thank you. For 2 years ago, for the work that's been done to provide more money to water, I would want to point out, I thought it was really pretty fantastic when we, on a Friday afternoon, which was on January 17th at 4:30 on Friday afternoon, we still had 200 stakeholders on the phone to figure out what was going on, how are the recommendations being received. There is good momentum. You can move forward with this. It's really important for our entire state. Stakeholders are anxious to see more results and more transparency. So we'll end with this slide. The next slide, please. This one. So at the water conference, we had this student panel, and I see Senator Dietrich smiling. So these are 4, 5 really smart students, K-State, KU, Fort Hays State. I'm very positive about our future. They all are doing work in water, and in particular, Joe on the far right. So he's at Fort Hays State. He's either a 4th or 5th generation farmer, and he wants to go back to his home farm. He's in ROTC. And he says it, I think, better than anybody else I've heard. He's like, you know, I want to have enough water so I can farm. And I want my someday kids, I don't have kids, I want my someday kids, and I want my someday grandkids. If they want to farm, I want them to be able to do that. And at the same time, and I want to do the right things. I want to use technology, I want to conserve water, and at the same time, I have to make a living. And that, I think, is sort of the point. How do we both assure a future and at the same time allow people to have a good income? And finding that sweet spot is what this plan helps outline. And so with that, I'm happy to stand for any questions you might have.
Thank you very much for being here today. Do we have questions? Yes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you. Good to see you again. So Kansas has done nothing in the area of dredging these lakes?
Oh, no, work has been done.
There has been?
Yes, and if you, and not being a water expert, I should be careful that I don't get over my skis. We have done dredging pilots, and if you have specific questions, I'd be happy to ask one of the agency members to come up and speak to the outcomes. No,
I was just more curious.
Yeah.
Not my wheelhouse, but this was a great presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
One of the things that I'm talking to the agent down in the Winfield area, and we do have our Winfield City Lake there. and it isn't just filling up with sediment as fast as some of the others because of the watershed ponds upstream. Is that part of the plan? Is that
So
part?
what we want, so one of the recommendations, and this is in the 2-year ramp-up period, is to do 2 watershed basins, for lack of a better word, plans to identify where you can do preventive measures. And that's, that old saying like pound of prevention, a penny of prevention is worth a pound of cure. That is taking a look at where we can incentivize our prevention programs, where we can build out better infrastructure, because it's way better to prevent than to have to go back and clean up later. Same thing exists on the contamination side, too. Good question.
Questions? Seeing none, thank you very much for
Thank
being
you.
here today. We
Thank you.
appreciate the information, and I think that water is one of our resources that we do have in the communities. And if we don't have water, our communities dry up.
That's right. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We have a few minutes here. Let's move on and discuss possible final action on a couple bills that we have previously heard. Senate Bill 51, and that is our data center bill. Would research give us or give us a short synopsis on what that bill was?
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
before you, I have some concerns and I have some meetings and some possible amendments that I haven't had an opportunity to get ready yet. So if the chair would be willing to delay this bill, I would appreciate it greatly, but.
We could delay the vote on the bill, if that'd be okay, is that what you're asking?
I won't have anything ready today, yeah, but I do have some meetings scheduled later this afternoon to get some stuff sorted out.
Okay, well, then what we'll do with that, honor that request, and move on to Senate Bill 52, which is the Kansas Film and Digital Media. So we'll ask if you could go ahead and do that.
Certainly, Mr. Chairman. Senate Bill number 52 would create the Kansas Film and Digital Media Production Development Act. And as you may recall, you heard more about this earlier this week. It would provide tax incentives for eligible projects produced in Kansas for the purposes of developing the film and digital media industry in Kansas. It had 2 components, an income tax credit and a sales tax exemption. And the income tax credit would be for a period of 10 years, beginning in 2025 through 2034. And I believe the sales tax exemption also would end after 2024.
Thank you. Any discussion, any questions? Yes, Senator Tyson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So Amelia, the sales tax credit, is that for building, and what is that sales tax credit for?
The sales tax exemption would include sales of tangible personal property or services that constituted production or post-production expenditures purchased for the purpose of a certified project by a production company that meets the requirements earlier in the provisions. It would also include sales of machinery and equipment and construction, maintenance, repair, and modification of sets, props, scenery, and other facilities constituting production or post-production expenditures. And there would also be a provision for the production company when they contracted for construction, reconstruction, remodeling of facilities for a certified project, that they could get project exemption certificates.
Okay. Senator Tyson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I guess it's pretty broad. So that means if they have meals or anything, the sales tax would be exempt if it's working on film production. Is that correct?
I would have to look back at some of the definitions of some of these production, the production and post-production expenditures. There are some definitions that may limit that some. There's also some ability, there is also the ability by the Secretary of Commerce when when the secretary is approving these projects to place limits on the sales tax exemption.
The Secretary of Commerce, not the legislature. Okay, I have some concerns over this, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Any other questions? Senator Owens?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We can certainly continue discussing, or if you're ready to entertain a motion.
I think, does anybody have any questions? Any other questions? Senator Tyson,
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a couple of amendments then.
do you have them with you?
No, but I didn't know we were working the bill today. I just got the agenda when I walked in, as did the revisers and research. So we do not have those. It would be a conceptual amendment to delete the transferability of the income tax.
Could you give me one more? Explain those again.
The first one would be to delete the transferability of the income tax portion of the bill.
Your second one was what?
I'd like to dispose of this one first, Mr. Chairman.
Since those are conceptual, right at the present time, I don't think we'll act on that today. We'll wait and do that tomorrow. If we can be ready for tomorrow's Friday, we're going to do that Monday. And we will meet Monday at 1:30. We will meet Monday at 1:30. We got all our work to do in a week. So we'll try to get that done. If there's nothing else, we are adjourned. Thank you very much.